First of all, thank you very much for everyone for joining, and also thank you very much for tabling all the questions that you did. There are quite a few questions. Hopefully we can tackle them all. So as you might know, IKEA Foundation is all about ending poverty while fighting and coping with climate change. And renewable energy fits quite prominently in that focus, because we think renewable energy is an enabler to allow families to afford a better life while staying within the planetary boundaries. So that's a little bit of an introduction on IKEA Foundation. I work at the Renewable Energy team, of course, with a number of other colleagues. We obviously are committed to 100% renewable energy for those that don't have energy access. There are about 1 billion people out there that don't have modern, reliable, affordable, and renewable energy access. So that's what we're trying to change. We are only as good as our partners, so it's exciting to have Harish Hande on the call with us because he's a real expert, and we're lucky to be able to work with SELCO Foundation and support their work. First of all, congratulations on your 10-year anniversary. So I think you would have been celebrating that 10-year anniversary in a couple of weeks.
Yes.
I'm sorry that we have to do it virtually, but how are things going for you right now?
I think it's been an interesting time. It's 10 years of SELCO Foundation and 25 years of SELCO India. But I think it's the time for us to step up. And I think while it's a crisis of an unprecedented nature, but I think it's where we believe that it is the time for SELCO to show its leadership in a sense where we've been talking about sustainability, we have been talking about poverty, we have been talking about social inclusiveness. I think this is where the philosophy of what we've been pushing for needs to come forward by showing our leadership. And so, yes, interesting times, but I think this is for us to make sure that sustainable energies like solar are able to prove a point that decentralized energy is the way to go, and to make sure that even if there are such crises in the future, the poor do not get affected as they have in this crisis.
Yeah, so you mentioned sort of a starting point for you is to really focus on impoverished families and how energy can be an enabler.
Right.
That journey started quite a long time ago,
Right.
already 25 years ago, when you
Right.
set up SELCO India as a social
Right.
entrepreneur. Can you tell us a little bit about that and sort of reflect on why you started then and what that looks like now? Like, who are you trying to serve, and what is sort of the main object and aim or like target group you're looking at in your work?
See, the target. Yes, we started in India, but our target group was mostly the poor. And if you look at the pyramid, the financial pyramid of the rich, the middle class, and the poor, but we break the poor into three categories: poor, very poor, and abject poverty. So what we basically try to do is how do you make sure that there is a platform or there is a foundation for all of us to have equal opportunities to jump from, to go towards our aspirations of better livelihoods, better education, better health. But unfortunately today, the rich and the middle class have a subsidized foundation, and the same foundation is not inclusive for the poor to actually jump from. And so what we used is solar and sustainable energy as a catalyst to make sure that those platforms become inclusive. It's one of the few things, sustainable energy are one of the few things that truly democratizes solutions. And that's exactly why we didn't have this whole thinking many years ago, for sure, but as we evolved. But our focus was that if at that point of time, X billion people who were in poverty and did not have reliable access to energy, we thought that if we were able to create appropriate solutions for them, then what would happen, that innovations would lead to more efficient world in many ways, sustainable world and inclusive. And that was 25 years ago. And I think a lot of it is still very much, and more so, unfortunately, valid. So a lot of, unfortunately, people think that we are a solar organization. We are an organization that believes in creating ecosystem that is sustainable and for the long run. And solar is just a medium.
So there's a lot of things that you talk about which generate some questions, I'm sure. But one thing, like picking a few things out. In 1994, everyone said solar is too expensive.
Right.
Why would you try to target the poorest population?
Right.
Can you respond on that? And maybe related, you talk about an ecosystem.
Sure.
So maybe could you talk about how like the techno fix isn't the end all cure all?
I think one saying or somebody said many years ago is that no power is more expensive than no power. The poor, if you look at in 1994, were paying so much for kerosene and alternative sources for energy, which, if looked at from a time scale, it was not only expensive for the poor, but they were remaining in poverty because they were keep spending that percentage of expense of their incomes on that. Unlike us, where we go on to say, okay, if we are going to make an investment, does it recover so that we don't waste our money on the same thing repeatedly? It's like you're having a fracture or a bleeding, and you keep putting a small band-aid and keep spending on that band-aid every month, every quarter. I think that was what was happening for many of the poorer population, that the expense of energy was actually not coming down. And when we talk about solar being expensive, we were talking about solar in a fixed cost, while other resources as an over a period of 10 years, because you're paying for monthly kerosene or monthly grid. I mean, what we were saying, that solar or any other form of energy should have been also looked at from the same time frame, that if the poor were able to buy solar over a period of 10 years or 5 years as an asset, it would have actually made it affordable. Even in 1994, when solar prices were 10 times more expensive, even then it was financially viable. The other parts of the ecosystem were missing, yes, but it was still viable. So more so now that the solar panel prices have come down, though we have a question mark on the batteries yet. But I think it's a matter of financing, technology innovation, efficiency of appliances that puts in all together to say that whether an intervention is affordable or not at the doorstep. And that's and today what happens. And when you buy a car, a lot of the housing, I mean, lot of the people in the developed part of the world, what I mean by developed, even I would consider parts of Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore, Washington, or Amsterdam developed. Why do we are able to afford a house? Is because we got in financing. If we were all told to buy a house on a credit card, none of us would have bought a house. House is an asset to a lot of us in the middle class and the middle class. We got it because we got long-term finance. That's exactly that needs to happen for the poor, that if they start owning assets, which is the only way to get out of poverty, they need to be financed on a longer term.
Yeah, so I think you touch on a few things, that it's quite expensive to be poor.
Yes.
Strangely enough, I've seen calculations where the poor are spending $8 per kilowatt hour, or $50 while we're paying maybe 22 cents, at least here in Europe.
Right.
There's not a level playing field. So I think in terms of long-term finance, you often hear centralized power plants, they can get a loan for 20, 30 years. And so that way, if you're choosing for solar, then it's like you have to pay 20 years upfront for your energy bill right away. Right. And for most consumers, that's not possible. But in other sectors, it is possible, like what you mentioned with the housing or maybe even a car. There's a finance structure. So some people have said a quick solution is maybe a small solar lantern that could displace kerosene expenditures. What is your take on that?
I'll answer that, Jeff, a minute. See, let's take the example today itself. As soon as the COVID lockdown is over, we will all jump on, say, a flight travel or some other. That's all subsidy. Can you imagine? That's all the subsidy we are going to get to fly. Next month, whoever is going to fly, whoever is going to go to the airports are taking subsidy because none of them are financially viable. So that means some governments are going to bail out, which will let a lot of us fly. That's a subsidy. So while it comes to the poor, we jump on to looking at what you call it, financial subsidy from day one, sustainability, but not looking at ecosystem. Coming to your point of small interventions, the issue with small interventions is that even when many years ago, one of the multilaterals said that there's $29 billion that is being spent by the poor for kerosene. So that's a big market for solar. That's a $29 billion market for solar. That's an unfortunate statement. The poor are poor because they are spending $29 billion. Our intervention should be in such a manner that they would be just spending $15 billion overall, and the rest $14 billion goes towards asset creation for their livelihoods, for health, etc. That is what the statement should have come out. And how is that possible? To create appropriate interventions that are longer term. With small lights, the margin of error is extremely small. A small layer of dust on a small solar panel, which is less than 1 watt or 2 watt, the margin of error is so high that it stops working in 6 months, maximum 1 year. So what are we telling to the people? That, okay, I'm going to give you a small solar light, but hey, you're going to buy it every year. How many such systems that we, the middle class and above middle class, that buy every year, except because we are fascinated by iPhones, that we have the luxury because it's an upgrade. But that's not the question in terms of the poor, where small light. We need to make sure that any intervention that we do for the poor has to be long-term, so that is it financially viable on a long-term perspective for the poor? Otherwise, their expenditures are going to remain the same, and they're going to remain in that poverty segment always. And that's why the small interventions like small solar lights, lanterns, have been a disaster. As far as you go and ask how many people have actually got out of poverty. Oh, people getting educated. I'm sorry, that's not true. The educated is a whole ecosystem. Are there good school teachers, and the light together actually makes the education. And you need larger systems at the school level, better digital education program. We're running on solar, larger lights at home, which actually makes it, and all can be financially viable. But we do is like, because our transaction costs are high, the people who actually deliver it, we go for the small quick wins, and that's dangerous in the game of poverty.
So maybe one more question, just setting the stage, because it's important to highlight your philosophy. So you touched on a few things. The position of the poor, an ecosystem that doesn't work for them, which basically is not only finance, but also a lot of other building blocks. You mentioned the quick wins, the quick fixes, the difference between being a consumer and an asset builder. So I'm just, because we're obviously talking about renewable energy and its enabling role, not only for livelihoods pre-COVID-19, but also post-COVID-19. So I'm just wondering, what's the difference in working and collaborating because of the COVID-19 in relationship to your work, which has been very focused on a pro-poor, level playing field, ecosystem building approach?
No, the COVID-19 upped the ante, Jeff. It's completely upped the ante in terms of that the approach is what should be. Because if you look at today, the problem is whether you look at the climate change crisis, or whether you look at a pandemic like COVID, the long-term sufferers are going to the poor, because it's not a short term. We all take in short-term insurance for saving ourselves. We create, and a lot of people are saying that we are having vacation and doing all these TikToks and the YouTubes about what we are doing at home. But we will all come out. Most of us will come out. Some might not have an employment for some time. Yes, we'll have a crisis in the middle class, but the poor, it's going to be a generational effect. And that's what climate change brings in, is it actually makes, if you look at the layer that I spoke about, poor, very poor and abject poverty, to go from one layer to another layer, it actually takes a generation. And now what happens in a climate change issue or in a COVID, where you have eroded the basic foundations of many of the societies, the poor category will go into very poor, and the very poor will go into abject poverty. That means it will take 10 to 14 or 15, it's generational to actually come up. And that is what we are saying, that sustainable energy interventions actually create those safety nets between those categories that people don't fall back. And that is democratization by decentralization. So for example, in India, where we have a lot of exodus of urban areas going back into the rural areas, if we are able to create centers of innovation using sustainable energy in rural, like solar powered pottery, solar powered silk weaving looms, solar powered or threshers, innovations in agricultural sector, local transportation, local utilization of the food, local utilization of fertilizers, local finance, decentralized, your local solar energy. Solar energy becomes local in many ways. It's not like you're exporting and importing from outside. Then you create a holistic society that is sustainable. And then going back to the whole concept of Gandhian movement in many ways. And COVID is actually pushing us to think more in those manner, Jeff.
Yeah, because I think some of the themes that you touch on often in our conversations is let's get the poor involved as innovators, entrepreneurs, and problem solvers. And let's find those champions. What are you seeing in sort of the health energy nexus in that respect? Could you give some examples?
I'm glad you brought in that point, because today many, I mean, just like as we've always used poor for only one thing, unfortunately, and that's for physical labor. That we think that's the only thing that they can actually contribute, which is a arrogancy and racism in many manners, right? That poor are an asset. Because we always confuse between intellectual poverty and financial poverty in many ways, and that needs to be that poor are partners, poor are philosophers, poor are mathematicians. I mean, we need to create an ecosystem where we make sure that the intellectual inputs, outputs, thought process of the 2.7 to 3 billion people are taken care of. And for that, we have to make sure that appropriate health and education systems are put in place, just like most of us have utilized the subsidy of education. I, in India, have completely utilized the subsidy of education to where we are. And that's the ecosystem, that's the internet. That, as we say, that the biggest subsidy Google has got is the internet. It did not pay for the creation of the internet. So in the health systems, if I go to this, COVID has actually shown that the stabilization and maturity of decentralized health systems in the rural areas would actually make the rural areas and the poorer populations more resilient. So what would that lead to? That means better health centers, better designed health centers, so they're more efficient and long lasting, high efficient equipments which are more modular, so that we are always not innovating on what extra value an X-ray machine can do, but can we do it more modular? Can we do it more high efficient? So as like a phone that has gone to remote areas, can an X-ray machine go? Can an infant incubator actually go? Can a baby warmer actually be in the rural areas? So this is an exciting time, unfortunate exciting, and don't take it in the wrong way, exciting, but time for health industry and energy industry to work together for a resilience intervention, and not as an intervention just because there's COVID. This you have to it's an intervention that we can restructure the whole energy health sector.
So getting on to some of the questions, I'm sorry, we're already 20 minutes into the call and we have about 30 more minutes. Yolanda asks, what can we do to ensure that achievements over the past 20 years will remain, and how can we limit a loss of livelihoods, especially for people living in poverty?
Thanks, Yolanda, for asking that question, because that's a very relevant, and a lot of people for us, and especially if you're talking of people in the who are working from home around the world, you are in a luxurious position. You are the rich. Let's put it that way. We should not be in a naivety that tomorrow, when the lockdown opens up and the societies open up, we are back to minus 3 weeks. I'm sorry, it's not minus 3 weeks. For many cases, it will be minus 10 years. And we should not say that our 10 years of work has gone down the drain. But what it is previously, when you do learnings, you are doing learnings to actually go forward, saying that what are the mistakes have I done? But in many of the cases, for NGOs and civil society and social enterprises that are actually working in the sector of poverty, you are actually again going to go forward. Imagine imagine as if you're back in 2010. Yes, don't worry about it. You're in 2010, but you already seen the future now. You are able to see the 10 years of future, what you have done. So make sure that you're not going to repeat the mistakes. You know what the answers are going to be. So now you are in a better position to use philanthropic money and to have better impacts, that as if you're in 2010, but you don't need to reach up to 2020, 10 more years to reach whatever we have done. I think with those mistakes that you already know will happen, you should be able to do immediately next 2 years what we should have been in 2015. And by 2024, we should be back in where we should have been in 2020. So I think this is a fast backward forward thinking that we need to look at, as if you're able to see the future now rather than learning from the past.
Yeah, so some of the work that you've done in the Northeast, in this Delta area, in terms of health and interventions with Karuna Trust, where you worked with a health champion that understood the ecosystem of health. You worked with them to really provide healthcare that went to impoverished families living in the rural areas. It's striking how you talk about that in our conversations, that instead of forcing those living in rural areas to spend money on transport and waiting to be sick enough to go to a health clinic in the city, you bring, thanks to efficiency in solar, you bring these services to them at a better price and better service. So maybe you can reflect on that, and we'll take the question of Craig Morgan, who asks, access to funding for rural clinics enabling solar. What are the possibilities for that, so that rural health clinics can communicate with national and international doctors? Have you been seeing anything like that? Is it necessary? Or would you say efficiency in solar brings a lot of services to the doorstep of the poor, so you might not need that?
No, it's interesting you say. I mean, I'm thanks, Greg, for again putting that question onto the table, because if you look at health and if you look at many of the rural areas, this is it's big. Health is one of as important or more important than stable incomes, because health can wipe out family savings for generations. Like if child falls sick, or a person, able-bodied person, who is actually the main income generator. And that's one of the crises that the developing country will face, developing countries like India and countries in Africa, that if able-bodied people in the house, who are the main bread earners, they start falling sick, it's another, and even when countries open up, that's going to be a chaos. And that is what we need to look at. How do we make the health systems resilient? And we have to realize that poor wipe out in many ways 40, 50, 100% of their savings. So high, and many of the cost is because they delay, because it takes too far to go. Many of they're referred to a next part, because that particular hospital does not have that sophistication of actually dealing it, and not much sophistication. I don't have an X-ray machine, I don't have a ventilator, I don't have a Tyndall chair. These are basics, right? So I think tying my answer to what Greg has asked is the willingness of capital markets, governments, and philanthropic organizations. In a moment, we decide that every country's 11% budget goes for defense, for fighting each other. That we spend 11% of our budget fighting each other, but we don't have budget to fight a virus together. And that's the irony. I think this is a point of reflection for all policymakers, bureaucrats, governments, philanthropists, we, the stakeholders. How do we pressure as democratic institutions? How do we pressure our governments? Reallocate the money. None of the guns and the grenades and the aircrafts are helping us fight this. Use that money to relook at health infrastructure for the world. 7 billion healthy citizens are more valuable, and there is no definition of financial comparison to where the money can come up. Money exists. 11% of every country is on defense. we need to reallocate. Hopefully, COVID has taught a lesson to many of the governments where to prioritize the money. And it cannot be on small philanthropic organizations to look at the structure. It is the high spending parts of our budgets overall that we need to relook at health budgets. Jeff.
So I think in answer to Craig Morgan's question, it would be more, how do you organize health facilities and answers that fit the rural poor, I think. So it really depends. It's not like a one size fit all, right? And to really push governments to react in an adequate way. And you also touch on sort of, often energy for productive use is sort of the thing that we look at as foundations, but you touch also on the thing that William asks, how do you define productive energy for sub-Saharan Africa? Health is also important for productive use. That's what you touch on, right?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, when people talk about productiveness, in a sense, if there are two parts, right, 2 or 3 parts, you need to have access to decent livelihoods, and you have to have decent access to health services, because both together actually make your social security. That if something goes wrong with him, I know I'll get rectified in a local health clinic, so I can. That's the insecurity of a lot of the poor, that what if something happens to me, I do not have a backup in health, my family will go under poverty. That actually forces the poor not to take risks, not to be very entrepreneurial, not to be innovative, because these are things that pushes them back. Oh, what happens if I have a fracture? That's it. I cannot innovate. I cannot actually do. So the health, incomes, well-being, all are very tied together. A society cannot be built on, I'm going to focus on this and not on that. I think it's a combination of both. And related to the last question, Jeff, again, we do a one size fits all, saying that this is what a tribal colony in Manipur should have in health systems versus a Mumbai PHC versus a Washington PHC or a PHC in Togo. There are basic infrastructure that is equal, that needs to be done for basic health services of every human being or every individual. Then there needs to be some sort of a customization according to the health, rather than wasting our money in just giving an X-ray machine to a rural health clinic, in a high expensive X-ray machine in Ecuador, without actually looking at, are the human resources ready, and do we need the X-ray machine in the first place? I think that permission is what is making this problem exciting. COVID-19 is rejigging our brains of how the world should look at, both in terms of income and because of health. These are two critical factors that many of us can actually start looking at in a very positive way, that we slowly are having a whiteboard, unfortunate whiteboard, where, okay, let's rethink. This is how do we go forward in a positive manner.
Yeah, and when you refer to the public health centers, the PHCs, there's different approaches suitable for a city or urban environment or a rural environment.
Population densities and population and the type of disease and type of incomes. If people in a certain area are working on mining, versus there are a lot of poor on the highways, you might need an operation theater because of trauma centers, because of accidents. There you need mining related or an arsenic related doc who's expert in actually, or in a place where you have too much of eyesight issues. So we need to customize a bit in terms of, and that's doable. I mean, that's very, very doable.
It's a very user-centered approach. It's very much listening to the needs of those that need it, are asking for it most, right?
Absolutely. And in today, aren't we doing a complete COVID, user centric? I mean, every patient is coming out different. We are not standardizing an approach. And that's exactly what we need to look at poor, is that every individual has different aspirations, different mechanisms. So we need to listen to people, rather than saying that, is my product going to be sold? I don't care whether they need it or not. How do I do with brilliant marketing methodologies? This consumption, I think it's taught us a bigger lesson, that it's not a lockdown. I'm again telling my friends and people in India, my citizens, and especially in the other parts, the richer citizens of the developing, this is not a vacation. This is where time to think, time to innovate, and jump into where we truly can make it an inclusive world.
So going back to the questions, Vishal, he asks, or she asks, is cold storage for daily use fruits and vegetables feasible in developing countries given its high costs? It does touch a little bit on sort of what, it's not a one size fit all, and let's look at the user needs, because you've done a lot of, through SELCO Foundation, you've done a lot of innovations in cold storage, which not are only applicable to sort of agricultural settings, but also for school settings and other settings. Maybe you could reply to that.
Thanks, Vishal, for putting that up. See, I always question what does a high cost actually mean. If we are using the same benchmark of high cost, then we should not be building a single airport in the world. None of the airports make financial sense. It's a subsidy that has been put in by the society so that we can fly and actually contribute to the GDP for whichever country we are. And that's a common subsidy we all enjoy. Same thing, when you look at larger assets or common assets in a village or a community, we need to think about how are the airports, how are the roads financed. That's an infrastructure that is an asset that does not belong to 5, 10, 20. So we need to look at cold storage as an asset that belongs to multiple, finance it over a period of 10, 15 years, where the poor pay for the utilization of the cold storage and not of the infrastructure. We don't pay for the roads. We just pay for the utilization of the roads. Roads never make money over a long. We countries like any of the developing or in countries get 30-year financing at 0% interest for roads. Similar concepts and thought process of financing needs to be done for assets like cold storage, because that is where cold storage are extremely. I'm glad the question came up on two issues, because it's very much related to COVID and it's very much related to climate change, because this is where the very many of the poor in the rural areas who are self-producers of vegetables, who can now be part of the economic change and transformation of food supply. I'm sure many parts of the world will go into food shortage. This is where we need to actually create this infrastructure of cold chains, where the poor start utilizing the cold storage so that they can get more value for the vegetables which would have otherwise got spoiled, more storage for other grains, storage for potatoes, everything. This is a cold storage is, and as the temperatures are increasing, anyhow we were thinking of those solutions, but I think COVID-19 actually accelerated that thinking process. And cold storage is going to be very critical.
Because here again, you refer to the importance of finance, but also looking at the mix of efficiency in solar, but also how are you going to make money off these assets? I think you've applied through SELCO Foundation and Mahela Housing Trust, you looked also at cold storage type of settings for schools, where schools are quite warm, 50 plus degrees Celsius. And you've changed the ambient temperature, reduced it to 30 or 20 degrees so that kids could study, right?
Right. So related to that same question, I want see people who are working on cooling and cold storage also should look at, it's not a simple cold storage. Also bring in architects to redesign how the cold storage inside could be designed, like Schiphol Airport, where you take a large suitcase, you get a bigger storage, a small one, you get a smaller storage, you rent according to that. So similarly, if you look at in the last couple of years, Jeff, more people have died inside the houses than outside during the summer months, and that's coming up in India now. Not only COVID, but now one of the issues we're saying, where is cooling effective, needs to be there. Schools, workplaces where the poor work, institutions, maternal labor rooms. So we said, we were challenging some of our cooling partners who are working on this cold storage, that you are bringing in 4 degrees centigrade or a vaccine to a minus in this. How far can we stretch the building that the temperature can actually remain between 28 to 30? And same technology utilization can be done for schools, for maternal labor rooms. And so what will happen now, Jeff, is that becomes a savior for multiple ways. Not only it's cool, not only that the poorer kids will come because there's another incentive. It's just like the midday meal mechanism in India. It's an incentive. And thirdly, this is the time for the livelihood applications to come up. And kids cannot be a so-called unnecessary, I mean, in the sense, for 6 hours they need to get educated. Now people should not reallocate their kids towards other work, which is going to happen because the schools are not ready or it's too hot. Let's put in incentives in education, so the focus remains on education, because in desperation people will get their kids out because the facilities are bad. Get the incentives high on education, get the kids up, get the cooling systems in, while concentrating on income generation and health. So health, education, cooling, everything gets tied down in a holistic manner, Jeff. And that's what COVID is actually teaching us in many ways, what we need to solve, and all those solutions are related to climate.
So Neil has a question related to this. What specific devices or solutions do we need more innovation in within healthcare, agriculture, and education space that can be supported through clean energy? It's a bit of a general question, but maybe you could highlight something specific from that.
Yeah, I mean, see, the thing is that a couple of years ago, Jeff, when I was talking to one of the largest manufacturers of health appliances in the world, the person said that most of the concentration for them was on value add and not on efficiency. Never thought of efficiency in health appliances, which is crazy thinking, because that means you never looked at, you're always assuming that input resources are going to be plenty. Always people are going to pay for it. Electricity infinite, abundant. There's nothing called as low resource setting. And I think when laptop industry looked at low resource setting, it was for, from Bangalore to San Francisco, can the battery last? Right? They started looking at efficiency for where it matters. But we need to relook at efficiencies of same thought process. What happens if I don't have 8 parameters in a rural area? Can my X-ray machine work? Can my basics of baby warmer that is needed for an infant delivery, that 8% of the infants are delivered in prematurely in areas where there's no energy, can my infant baby warmer? That is the set of innovations that the world and the world should. And I would actually push philanthropic organizations to push for innovations on that end, which is the basic needs of. It's not about new things. It's not about remodify existing things, relook at that innovation. Agri sector, something that he mentioned, is something that innovation needs to happen today. Why people are moving away, why agriculture is a 4-letter word, is because it's drudgery. I don't want to be known that my father-in-law is a farmer. Farming is not a sexy word. Oh, that's exactly, we need to rework on efficient. How do we make it aspirational? How do we make it aspirational? By innovating on devices that are needed by agriculture, whether it is a thresher, whether it's a rice mill, whether it's any puff making the puffed rice making machine, highly efficient, lessening drudgery, making it aspirational. That means the next generation. And this is the time to look at agriculture and health. Absolutely, we are going into food shortage, we're going to health crisis. This is where the innovations will happen.
So efficiency and any drudgery in many things. So Chen has a question: how to rapidly electrify clinics and meet urgent medical needs in a situation like COVID-19? More importantly, what are the challenges you have seen so far in doing so?
Yeah, and also I didn't answer the question. I'll answer that also. What are the type of livelihoods in sub-Saharan Africa? Chen, the answer is that we need to invest into more vernacular speaking local entrepreneurs that are not shaken up. Because again, I hear in our field, in energy access field, oh, let's bail out, in a sense that it's too big to fail. I think that's something I don't want to hear in the energy sector, because energy sector has a chance to democratize the delivery of what you call it as delivery of energy access in a democratic manner, where the rural entrepreneurs and rural enterprises have a chance to succeed. And we need to invest. And once we start investing into those, what will happen is we are making the local areas resilient. And then the movement of solar panels and batteries, which is what would be little away from them, is the only thing that we need to worry about when we're looking at electrification of health centers, recapitalization of livelihoods in the rural areas. That is where we need to actually focus on. And that is where, once we look at that large-scale deployment of energy enterprises in the rural areas, we will see large-scale deployment in the health center. Just going and putting solar panels on health is not going to until we build the local capacity. And it is time to invest, and not local capacities in terms of just technician training, but potential entrepreneurs who can run it as a long-term business. And somebody asked the question of income in Sub-Sahara. Absolutely. There are so many income generating activities in Sub-Sahara that what we need, what is unfortunately lacking in Africa, is long-term finance. And short-term finance, where a lot of short-term finance is not, if poor need to build an assets, as we said, in the developing part, whether it's Amsterdam and Delhi, we all buy houses because we got long-term financing. Somebody needs to subsidize the infrastructure of finance in rural Africa. We might lose out 100% money in the first year, second year 80%, but in 10 years, we would actually have long-term financing. And that's what I would push the institutions like the World Bank, the IFC, the EU, and the African Union to create that infrastructure of rural finance. And that will lead to uptake of rural livelihoods in Africa.
I think that's where you mentioned before that Grameen Bank, the success depended very much on that kind of infrastructure, right?
Yeah, they nearly gone. Grameen Bank and BRAC, the two large, actually had more than, I think, $500 million of grant money to create what has happened in Bangladesh. And grants led to, grant is, everything grant is the wrong word, but we use airports. That's granted.
So Rana asks, related to this, what are some of the financial incentives that can be offered to consumers to promote the use of renewable energy?
There are multiple things. In a sense, one for the end users, it's more about sometimes it's the lower interest. Just like, I would say if you piggyback on housing loans, which are lower interest in many of these countries, it's a long-term finance is one of the biggest incentive for people to get in renewable energy. Today, in many countries, renewable energy is absolutely competitive with any other form of energy, whether it's, I'm not talking anti anything else, but its financing is the key, provided we also work on efficiency of appliances. It's not powering solar with inefficient buildings and inefficient computers and say solar is expensive. But nobody blames the efficiency of the appliances. I think we need to work in tandem along with affordable finance. All three need to come together.
Altaf has a question. In a world where we take energy consumption for granted, what is it that we can do to make access easy for those who need it most at this critical juncture?
See, I'm glad Altaf asked that, Jeff, because when people say how many people are off grid, we have negatively used the word off grid as if these are people poor and poor people are in off grid. Does it mean that 100 years ago everybody was poor because there was no grid at all in the first place? So let's demarcate in our thought process that off grid means poor. But on the other hand, off grid is not we always say that if 1.6 billion people are off grid, why is that the rest 3.5 people are still on grid? Because they are on grid, you're making it expensive on appliances and innovation for the rest 2.7 billion people to access energy in the manner that is sustainable. I think, Altaf, the beauty of this is renewable energy is that the 2.7 billion poor people are going to redefine what consumption is, are going to redefine what energy is going to be, redefine the way of living where the rest 3 billion people will have to follow.
There's one more question, Sinathesa. She asked, sorry for not being able to pronounce your name correctly, but how do you stay positive and continue to find hope when working in extremely challenging circumstances, improving livelihoods for the poorest communities?
I think to the what's a complicated name, as you said, the problems that we are facing is less than like 0.000001% of the poorest person in Odisha or Jharkhand or in Nigeria or in New York, Harlem, or in lower parts of Paris. That is nothing. We are facing nothing, and so that our problems are nothing. So I think relooking at, is there a way where we can work together to actually solve it? And that's and it's like getting up at 3 a.m. that's a problem that's lingering and we need to solve it. And that should keep us all positive. And it has to come from, you're living in this world for 70, 80, 90 years. You cannot be living for your own 2-car garage and 2 kids, and you are living in so that the 7 billion. Look at the virus has wiped out boundaries between mankind, wiped out boundaries between religions, caste, white, black, blue, everything is dead. I think we need to be positive, yes, and we have the option to be positive.
Yeah, I think you often refer to climate change and inequity, disparities in wealth as man-made, so they're also solvable. And so I always find it inspiring. I know you went to you might say an elite school, where a lot of your classmates went off to different occupations, including all the Indian engineers in California and say some few classmates at Google. Like what inspired you to actually not choose that path? Was it because of these challenges that it's solvable and so little attention and money is going to the problem?
Yeah, yes, I agree. I went to a so-called elite school, Jeff, because I wrote an exam where 300 million Indians could not write the exam because they did not have the opportunity to write the exam. So it's a sad way and it's completely subsidized by the poor who buy salt and sugar, and those taxes actually led to my education. So I turning around and said, boss, I've got the best education in the country, and now typical I have to provide value to my stakeholders. That's what they say in private companies. Who are my stakeholders? The poor of the world are my stakeholders. I think this is where we need to relook at why are you the privileges that you have got. It has to be on why did you get those privileges in the first place, and is it ethical, and was it inclusive? I'm sorry, it was not inclusive, and I know some of my friends are here. It was never inclusive. I think, how do we use the education, the privileges that we have got, in a way that is an equitable world? Because the most expensive thing for the world is going to be the social unsustainability.
So we're about 2 minutes over time, 3 minutes. I guess rounding up the questions with a final question, what is the first thing you will do when things go back to normal after the COVID-19 crisis? What is what's first on the agenda?
No. The first is our agenda is to make sure that we've been in touch with all my colleagues and all everything, but more importantly, that it's be ready that for a lot of the poor, COVID is every day. A lot of the poor, climate change is every day. I think we should not let the pressure cooker actually loosen. The pressure needs to be on all of us, and that's what I'm going to tell all my younger colleagues. This is what you were. The pressure cooker has been put on us. Please don't get the lid off.
So I think we have about 1 more minute, so maybe we take one more question. Is there anything, maybe we can round off with any last comments from you, Harish? There's so many questions, we can't answer them all, so hopefully we'll be able to directly answer them later. Yes. And provide some resources for people to look at. Is there any last final words that you?
No, my question is between the collaboration that we've had with both IKEA Foundation and us, and along with our other partners like Good Energies and Dune Foundation, Lemelson. I think it's the flexibility of having the resources to make sure such innovations for the poor can actually happen. But telling everybody that when you go back after the lockdown tomorrow is that please think about in any manner, how can we make this world a little more inclusive so that we don't have to go through, not the pandemic, but that the poor don't have to go through the way they're going through today. And that's my request, my plead, and everything else, Jeff.
Well, thanks so much, Harish. I'm letting Ryan round things up, my colleague at IKEA Foundation.
Thank you so much, really, to both of you. It was a fantastic conversation. We got some really nice comments coming through Facebook and YouTube, so I know it was appreciated by those watching. So thank you to all those who watched us and joined us for our second Ask an Expert session, and of course to Harish and Jeff for spending the time with us. Really appreciate it. And yeah, we will maybe send some extra questions to you, Harish, and then post the answers on the Ask an Expert website.